At just 19, Princess Chen of the Jin dynasty was forced to drink a cup of poison in silence. She had committed no crime, yet her royal blood marked her as dangerous in a fractured court. Her death left only a faint trace in the chronicles, a cruel reminder that politics spares no innocence, where even a young girl could be erased for nothing more than her lineage. Princess Chen was born into the illustrious yet perilous halls of the Jin dynasty, a royal child whose very existence carried both privilege and danger. From the moment she opened her eyes to the world, she was surrounded by silk draperies, golden ornaments, and the solemn rituals of the imperial palace. Servants moved quietly around her, bowing with reverence as if her presence alone demanded a hush of awe. Yet beneath the shimmer of jade ornaments and painted screens, the air of the palace always carried a weight of suspicion. As a child, Princess Chen would wander the gardens of the inner palace, her small hands brushing against the blossoms of plum trees that bloomed despite the cold winters. These blossoms, fragile yet resilient, mirrored her own life, beautiful, delicate, but subject to the harsh winds of fate. She was taught to speak with grace, to move with poise, and to memorize the Confucian classics. For her role was not only to embody royal dignity, but also to become a symbol of the dynasty's refinement. Her earliest memories were not of toys or laughter, but of hushed conversations behind screens. Ministers, concubines, and eunuchs whispered constantly about matters of succession, alliances, and rivalries. Though too young to understand, she could feel the undercurrents of unease that ran through the corridors. Even her mother's embrace carried a subtle tension, as though every gesture of affection might one day be used against them. Unlike children of common households, Princess Chen could not cry freely, could not misbehave, and could not reveal her heart openly. Every expression, every movement was noted by watchful eyes. She grew up learning that silence was safety, and composure was survival. Her tutors praised her for her intelligence and her ability to recite poetry. But they also reminded her that her words could carry consequences far beyond her intention. In her early adolescence, the princess began to hear her name woven into political discussions. Her beauty, which shone even in her youth, was whispered about as a potential instrument of alliance. Nobles and generals speculated about whom she might marry, for her hand was not hers to give. It was a prize, a key that could open doors to power or close them forever. She was both cherished and endangered because of it. The palace itself was a paradoxical place for a child. Its marble floors and painted halls gleamed in the light of lanterns, yet shadows always lingered in the corners. Festivals were grand, filled with music and dance. But behind the silk curtains, rivalries brewed, and the joy seemed staged, as though no one dared to celebrate too freely. Princess Chen grew up in this duality, learning that her lineage was both her shield and her curse. Her childhood was not marked by play, but by the slow realization that she was born into a life where innocence could not last. She was a daughter of the Jin, a living emblem of the dynasty, and therefore her fate would always be tied to the shifting tides of politics. Though still young, she sensed that her destiny was not her own to command. The little girl who once chased butterflies in the palace garden would one day be remembered not for her laughter, but for her silence. From her earliest days, the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The 3rd century was a time of relentless turmoil for the Jin dynasty. Founded upon the ashes of the once mighty Wei, Jin promised stability, but soon crumbled under the weight of ambition and division. The court was a battlefield where pens and swords were equally lethal, where ministers plotted in candlelit chambers and generals drew lines of loyalty that shifted as quickly as the wind. For Princess Chen, the grandeur of her lineage meant little against the backdrop of chaos that defined her world. The empire was vast, stretching across fertile lands and populous cities, but it was also fractured. Internal rivalries between imperial princes erupted into open conflict, and each struggle for the throne left rivers of blood in its wake. The dynasty was plagued by what history would later call the War of the Eight Princes. Brothers turned against brothers, uncles plotted against nephews, and the imperial family became both the crown's strength and its greatest weakness. In this storm of suspicion, a young princess was never merely a daughter or sister. She was a potential pawn, her future marriage a dangerous weapon in the hands of whoever controlled it. Every whisper in the court could change destinies. Rumors of rebellion traveled faster than truth, and alliances were forged and broken overnight. A single marriage could tilt the balance of power, granting legitimacy to one prince or strengthening the hand of a rival warlord. Princess Chen, though not yet of age, already carried within her the possibility of altering the empire's fragile equilibrium. The palace reflected the empire's instability. Eunuchs gained influence by selling secrets. Noble families shifted allegiances with calculated precision. And even loyal officials could find themselves accused of treason if their counsel displeased the ruler. For a young girl in such an environment, fear became second nature. She grew up listening to the cries of exiled courtiers being escorted from the palace, the muffled sobs of women discarded by shifting fortunes, and the endless echoes of conflict that seeped through the grand halls. The dynasty's decline was not a sudden collapse, but a slow unraveling. Each act of betrayal weakened the bonds that held the empire together. The people outside the palace walls suffered as heavy taxes and constant wars drained their strength. Rebellions flared, famines spread, and the once glorious dynasty struggled to maintain its authority. In this tempest, Princess Chen's existence was precarious. She was a daughter of the throne, but also a reminder of divided loyalties. Her blood tied her to factions within the court, whether she wished it or not. She had no voice in these matters, yet she was implicated all the same. To live as a princess in the Jin dynasty was not to be free, but to be trapped in a web of politics where each thread could tighten into a noose. The storm around her grew louder with each passing year. The empire that was supposed to shield her instead became the stage of her undoing. She was born into a dynasty at war with itself, and in such a war, no one was safe. Not even a 19-year-old girl whose only crime was her name. As Princess Chen grew into adolescence, her fragile youth became both her blessing and her curse. She embodied the virtues praised by the court, beauty that seemed to soften even the harsh light of the palace lanterns, and a composure far beyond her years. Courtiers and attendants alike spoke of her serenity, the way her words carried a gentle harmony, the way her gaze reflected dignity despite her tender age. Her presence was often compared to a luminous pearl hidden in the depths of the imperial treasury. Rare, precious, but always at risk of being stolen or shattered. At banquets, her delicate movements, the slight lowering of her head, and the careful arrangement of her sleeves became topics of admiration among nobles. Yet, admiration was never free of consequence. Her radiance drew eyes not only of those who adored her, but also of those who feared what her future might represent. In the politics of the Jin dynasty, beauty was not a gift to be celebrated. It was a currency. Her virtue and grace were translated into calculations. Which family could secure her hand, which alliance might gain legitimacy through her marriage, and which rival faction could be weakened by denying her to another. Though still a young woman, Princess Chen was constantly assessed not as a person, but as a strategy. As if her entire being were reduced to a chess piece on a vast and perilous board. She must have felt the tightening of this invisible net. While her tutors instructed her in the refinement of poetry and the subtlety of calligraphy, whispers circulated in the court that her marriage would soon be arranged. To some, she represented a bridge of peace, a way to bind hostile families. To others, she was a looming danger, for her union could embolden enemies and shift the delicate balance of power. At times, she attempted to escape these suffocating designs by retreating into the palace gardens. There, beneath the plum blossoms or by the quiet ripples of the lotus pond, she could momentarily imagine herself as simply a young woman, free from the burden of dynasty. Yet even nature seemed complicit in reminding her of her fate. The blossoms, though radiant, withered quickly. The ripples, though calming, always returned to stillness. Her freedom, like theirs, was fleeting. The fragility of her youth lay not in her body, but in the vulnerability of her position. Unlike her brothers, who were trained in warfare and governance, she was never allowed to wield overt power. Yet her value was no less significant, for in the intricate fabric of the Jin dynasty, a princess could reshape destinies through a single marriage contract. Her very existence was a silent force, one that frightened the ambitious and unsettled the paranoid. The irony was cruel. While her beauty and grace earned her praise, those same qualities ensured that she would never truly belong to herself. In her adolescent years, as she stepped from childhood into womanhood, she found no liberation. Instead, she walked deeper into a cage forged of jade and silk, a cage disguised as privilege. Her youth was fragile, not because it was fleeting, but because it was never her own. She lived under constant surveillance. Every gesture noted, every word weighed, every potential suitor a matter of empire. And though she bore it with dignity, the shadow of suspicion had already begun to follow her. In her luminous presence, others saw not innocence, but danger. And in her fragile youth, the seeds of her tragic fate continued to take root. Marriage, in the imperial court, was never about affection. It was a carefully chosen weapon, designed to bind families, cement alliances, or dismantle rivalries. For Princess Chen, her engagement was a matter of state long before she was old enough to understand the meaning of devotion. She was promised to a powerful clan, a family whose loyalty could have fortified the throne in a time of turbulence. The news of her betrothal spread across the palace like the fluttering of banners before a battle. Ministers nodded in approval. Generals calculated the new balance of influence, and servants whispered about the grandeur that awaited the young princess. It seemed that her life, fragile though it was, had been given a clear path. Yet politics has a way of devouring even its own promises. The winds of power shifted abruptly. A rival faction gained influence at court, and suddenly, the very marriage that had been celebrated as salvation became a threat. Whispers began to circulate that such a union would strengthen the wrong hands, tilting the precarious scales against the ruling prince. The betrothal that once secured her future now endangered it. The engagement was quietly annulled, but the damage was done. Once seen as a jewel of the dynasty, Princess Chen became a liability. Her rejected suitor's family bore silent resentment, while other factions eyed her with suspicion, wary of her potential as a pawn in future games. Her identity transformed from asset to burden, and in the ruthless theater of politics, a burden could swiftly become a target. For the princess herself, the collapse of her engagement was not merely a personal disappointment, but a profound humiliation. though she had no choice in the matter. Blame clung to her, as though she were the architect of betrayal. She must have felt the sting of abandonment, of being passed over not because of any fault of her own, but because of calculations that reduced her worth to a tool of convenience. Her chambers, once filled with hopeful chatter about wedding garments and ceremonial processions, grew quiet. The laughter of maids preparing for festivities was replaced by tense silence, their eyes avoiding hers, as if to acknowledge her broken betrothal was to invite misfortune upon themselves. Princess Chen, still barely a woman, now bore the invisible scar of failure that was never hers to claim. Yet what was most cruel was how swiftly the court turned its gaze. Once courted, now discarded, she remained trapped in the palace, a living reminder of unstable politics. No longer a bride-to-be, she became a piece left vulnerable on the board, waiting to be claimed, or worse, sacrificed. The annulled marriage marked a turning point. For Princess Chen, it was the beginning of her descent from cherished daughter to dangerous symbol. She had tasted the fragility of promises in the imperial court, and in that fragility lay the first shadows of her doom. The girl who had once been seen as a bridge of peace was now watched with suspicion, as though her very existence threatened to tear the fragile empire apart. As the dynasty fractured under the weight of its own ambition, suspicion became the currency of survival. In the palace, whispers moved faster than proclamations, and every gesture was interpreted through the lens of fear. Princess Chen, who once embodied the promise of royal lineage, now found herself caught in the shadows of distrust. When civil war erupted among rival princes, the accusations began. Some factions claimed that her mother's family harbored secret ambitions, that they conspired to place their own bloodline closer to the throne. These charges were never proven, nor were they grounded in evidence. But in an empire built upon paranoia, the mere possibility of treachery was enough to plant a seed of danger. Princess Chen herself had no voice in these matters. She was a young woman with no command over armies, no control over policies, no influence beyond the walls of her chamber. Yet her silence did not shield her. To the paranoid court, her innocence was irrelevant. She was guilty not of action, but of existence, of being born with a name and a lineage that could be twisted into a threat. It was in this climate that rumors spread like wildfire. Courtiers whispered that the princess corresponded secretly with her mother's relatives. Others suggested that her very beauty made her a dangerous tool in the hands of enemies. Her face, once a symbol of grace, was now reimagined as a mask of hidden intent. Each story, each fabricated tale, added weight to the invisible chain tightening around her life. Her days became filled with unease. The attendants who once approached her with warm smiles now avoided her gaze. Conversation stopped abruptly when she entered a room. She began to live in a silence thicker than solitude, where every glance carried suspicion and every shadow hinted at betrayal. The cruelty of the situation lay in its inevitability. Once suspicion took root, it could not be undone. The princess could have devoted herself to ritual piety. She could have withdrawn into seclusion, and still it would not have been enough. The very fact of her existence within a divided dynasty meant that someone, somewhere, would imagine her as a danger. As weeks passed, the accusations grew louder. The court, already fractured by bloodshed and rivalries, found it convenient to cast blame upon the defenseless. By targeting her, factions could demonstrate loyalty to the throne, distract from their own ambitions, or redirect the fury of suspicion away from themselves. Princess Chen became a scapegoat, a vessel into which the paranoia of the empire was poured. For the young princess, This was the cruelest betrayal of all. She had never sought power, never raised her voice in defiance, never strayed from the path of dignity expected of her. Yet dignity could not protect her in a court where innocence was meaningless. At 19, she stood beneath the crushing weight of suspicion, and there was no path left open to her but silence. The shadow of doubt was no longer behind her. It surrounded her entirely, and in its cold embrace, her fate was sealed. When the tide of suspicion could no longer be contained, the decision was made in secret. There was no trial, no formal accusation, no chance for defense. A decree was written in elegant strokes upon a scroll, its words cold and merciless. The princess must die. The order came not from public proclamation, but from the hidden chambers of power, where rulers and ministers cloaked their fears in the language of necessity. They spoke of preserving stability, of extinguishing the spark of rebellion before it could ignite. But beneath these justifications lay the truth. Her death was not justice, but expedience. The message traveled quietly through trusted messengers. Guards who had once bowed in respect now received instructions that chilled their blood. Servants whispered in disbelief, yet none dared to question. In a court where the fate of princes shifted with each sunrise, who would risk defying a command so absolute? For Princess Chen, the sentence was never spoken aloud. She learned of it not through official declaration, but through the heavy silence of those around her. Her attendants, once careful but kind, now treated her with a solemn distance, as though mourning her even before her final breath. Their eyes betrayed sorrow, but their lips remained sealed. The cruelty of the decree lay in its secrecy. By ordering her death in silence, the court denied her even the dignity of a farewell. No ritual trial, no ceremonial judgment, only a decision scribbled upon a page, carried into her chamber like a shadow that could not be dispelled. This was how the empire extinguished its own blood. Not with spectacle, not with public condemnation, but with a hidden command designed to erase her existence as though she had never mattered. The silence surrounding the decree was more suffocating than any chain. It was the silence of deliberate forgetting. One imagines the princess sitting alone in her chamber as the truth unfolded. Perhaps she watched the flickering of a candle and understood that its flame would soon outlast her. Perhaps she held the embroidered sleeves of her robe and realized that even silk could not shield her from the cold hand of authority. She had no sword to resist, no allies to plead for her, no chance even to declare her innocence. Her fate was sealed in a few lines of ink written by a hand that never trembled. This was not only the end of her youth, but also the erasure of her name. To kill her in silence was to deny her story, to ensure that history would carry only faint echoes of her existence. In that moment, she ceased to be a princess and became an inconvenience, a problem solved by the stroke of a brush. The Len B. Mat was not only her death sentence. It was the empire's confession, a testament to its fear, its cruelty, and its willingness to sacrifice even its own children to preserve the fragile illusion of control. The moment arrived with no ceremony, no announcement, no acknowledgement of her royal blood. In a quiet chamber, dimly lit by a single oil lamp, Princess Chen was presented with a cup. Its surface was unremarkable, a simple vessel of clay. Yet within it lay the empire's cruelest decree. The liquid inside was dark and heavy, an opaque mixture of poison prepared not for justice, but for silence. She sat before it, her slender hands trembling as the cup was set upon the low table. Around her, attendants stood rigid, their faces pale, their eyes lowered. No one dared to meet her gaze, for to see her suffering would be to share in it. And sharing was dangerous in a court that punished compassion as treason. The princess knew there was no escape. The air itself seemed to thicken with inevitability, pressing upon her lungs, forcing her to confront the finality of what lay before her. Her life, which had been shaped by others since her first breath, was now to be ended by the same invisible hands of power. Tears welled in her eyes, though she fought to hold them back. Dignity, instilled in her since childhood, demanded that she face death without collapse. Yet she could not stop the trembling of her fingers as she lifted the cup. The bitter scent of the concoction rose to meet her, mingling with the salt of her tears. One imagines that as the rim touched her lips, memories must have surged. Childhood walks among the plum blossoms, lessons in poetry recited under candlelight, laughter long since silenced by suspicion. Each memory clung to her like a final plea to live. But there was no mercy left in the halls of the Jin dynasty. She drank. The poison burned as it slid down her throat, an unholy fire that spread through her veins. Her body recoiled instinctively, but she forced herself to swallow, knowing resistance would only bring a harsher end. Her tears fell freely now, not only from sorrow, but from the physical agony searing through her. The attendants stood frozen. No one cried aloud, no one reached out to hold her. To do so would risk their own lives. Silence was their armor, even as it became her shroud. The young princess, only 19, sat alone in the midst of others, yet utterly abandoned. As the poison took hold, her breaths grew shallow. Her vision blurred, and the world dissolved into fragments of sound. The crackle of the oil lamp, the faint rustle of silk, the muted heartbeat pounding in her ears. She clutched at the fabric of her robe, her once steady hands reduced to desperate spasms. And then, slowly, her body gave in. The trembling ceased, her tears dried upon her cheeks, and her form slumped gently to the side, like a fragile blossom cut down by an unseen blade. The cup, empty now, remained on the table, its stain a silent witness to the Empire's cruelty. In that vessel lay the paradox of her existence, born royal, yet powerless, destined for grace, yet condemned to erasure. The Chen did not simply claim her life. It silenced her voice, extinguished her light, and left behind only the hollow echo of a name that history would nearly forget. Death should have carried with it a mourning befitting her birth. As a princess of the Jin dynasty, her passing ought to have been marked by rituals, incense, and lamentations sung by court musicians. Yet none of these honors were granted. Her death was not celebrated, not even acknowledged. It was concealed, hurried, and buried beneath layers of silence. Her body, once adorned with silks and jewels, was treated without ceremony. There was no grand procession through the palace gates, no banners lowered in grief, no proclamations sent across the empire. Instead, her remains were quietly taken away under the cover of night. Her lifeless form wrapped hastily as though she were not of royal blood, but of no consequence at all. The burial was carried out swiftly, in a forgotten corner where no mourners gathered. A few attendants, sworn to obedience, lowered her into the earth. Their hands moved mechanically, but their hearts surely ached. Yet, even in grief, they dared not falter. No tears could fall openly, for to weep for her was to declare sympathy, and sympathy was dangerous in an empire that demanded silence. Her name was erased from records, her life reduced to a whisper. The chronicles of the dynasty, meticulous in cataloging the deeds of princes and generals, made little room for her existence. Where her name should have stood proudly among the daughters of Jin, there remained only a faint trace, a deliberate omission. For the people beyond the palace walls, the death of a princess was never announced. The empire wished for no questions, no speculation. To the world, she had simply vanished, as though she had never walked beneath the plum blossoms, never recited verses, never smiled with quiet dignity. Yet silence has its own weight. The absence of mourning became a kind of presence itself, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had been stolen from the world. Her death was not only an end, but an erasure, and in that erasure lay the empire's deepest cruelty. Imagine the halls of the palace after her departure. Gilded corridors unchanged, banquets still held, officials still plotting. The world continuing as if her life had not been extinguished. The indifference of power was perhaps more brutal than the poison that killed her. She had been erased not only from the world of the living, but from the memory of those who governed it. And yet, even silence cannot wholly contain grief. Those who served her surely remembered. Perhaps an attendant lit a hidden candle in her honor, whispering her name into the night. Perhaps her mother, bound by fear, wept in secret where no eyes could see. Perhaps even a guard, hardened by years of service, felt the sting of shame when he turned away from her final moments. Her death in silence revealed the true nature of the dynasty. It was a world where fear eclipsed compassion, where memory itself was a danger, where even the life of a princess could be extinguished without a trace. She was 19 years old. Her death was not merely an end, but a deliberate forgetting, a vanishing act orchestrated by the very court that had once celebrated her birth. In silence, she was buried. In silence, she was erased. And in silence, she became a ghost, not of flesh, but of memory, lingering forever in the shadows of history. Although the imperial court tried to erase her existence, whispers of Princess Chen's tragic fate slipped beyond the palace walls. Among common people, where stories traveled on the lips of wandering poets and in the murmurs of market stalls, her death was never forgotten. The tale of a young princess, forced to drink poison at 19, stirred both sorrow and unease. Fishermen on riverbanks told each other that on nights when the water shimmered under moonlight, they could see the faint reflection of a young woman with dark hair trailing like mist, her eyes filled with grief. Farmers spoke of strange chills in the early morning, as though the land itself carried her silent lament. In villages far from the capital, her name lived on in lullabies disguised as folk songs, where mothers whispered verses about a girl cut down before her time. The most haunting stories described her as a restless spirit. It was said that, in the deep hours of night, a figure in white robes wandered the palace gardens, her hair damp with dew, her footsteps leaving no trace. Her face bore neither rage nor peace, only the endless sorrow of someone wronged by the very blood that defined her. These visions became so ingrained in collective memory that they shaped a kind of unspoken legend. Princess Chen, the daughter who should have lived, the princess silenced too soon. These tales were more than superstition. They were the people's way of resisting the silence imposed by rulers. Where the court chose to forget, the common folk remembered. Where the dynasty attempted erasure, the villagers restored her with their stories. Though stripped from official records, her presence lingered in the oral traditions of those who knew that power could kill, but could not erase entirely. For generations, her story was retold not as history, but as caution. Mothers warned their daughters of the cruelty of courts, teaching them that beauty and birth could be as dangerous as poverty. Fathers, gazing into the distance, spoke of how even the innocent could become victims of suspicion when rulers feared shadows more than truth. In this way, Princess Chen became more than a forgotten name. She became a symbol of injustice, a reminder of how fragile life was under the weight of dynasty, and how dangerous it was to be born into the wrong bloodline at the wrong moment. Though erased by ink, she was preserved by memory. Though silenced by poison, she continued to speak through rumor and story. The legend of her ghost was not one of vengeance, but of sorrow. It reflected the quiet grief of a people who lived under the same rule that killed her. They could not challenge the dynasty openly, but in their tales they carved a space for compassion, a way of giving dignity to the girl denied it in life. Thus, in the hearts of the people, Princess Chen endured, not as a name in chronicles, but as a shadow among blossoms, as a sigh in the night wind, as a figure who refused to be entirely forgotten. The life of Princess Chen was not lost to her own mistakes, but to the accident of her birth. She was guilty of nothing except carrying the blood of a dynasty fractured by its own ambition. At 19, she became the victim of a system that consumed even its own children to preserve illusions of power. Her tragedy revealed the paradox of royalty. Born into splendor, yet denied freedom. Surrounded by silks and jewels, yet abandoned in her final moments. Named a princess, yet treated as expendable when suspicion demanded a sacrifice. Her story is not only about death, but about the silence that followed it. The silence of a court that refused to mourn, the silence of history that chose to omit her, and the silence forced upon her in her last breath. Yet even silence carries weight, and in that weight, her story endures as a mirror of power's cruelty. Princess Chen's brief life shows us how fragile dignity becomes when authority fears its own shadow. It is a reminder that political games are written not only in laws and battles, but in the lives of the young and the innocent, whose fates are determined without their consent. At 19, she became a symbol of how easily humanity is discarded when power demands sacrifice. And though her name faded from records, her story continues to echo as a quiet accusation against the brutality of history.